Yo, what's up? Gleb Alexandrov here for CreativeShrimp.com. Welcome to the new very exciting tutorial. In this Blender tutorial, I'll walk you through the creation of the advanced glass shader with dispersion, chromatic aberration, volumetric absorption, fake caustics, and all the right boxes ticked in Cycles. Because yeah, Cycles is still very powerful, but before we get started, warning! To complete this tutorial with relatively low levels of pain, you will need a pretty powerful video card, but if you dare, go ahead. Now, before we get started, there are many different algorithms of global illumination: path tracing, bidirectional path tracing, SPPM or stochastic progressive photon mapping, spectral rendering stuff. Each one of these algorithms has its own pros and cons, and there is no silver bullet, but because we're gonna be dealing with the glass shader in particular, it is important to pinpoint some differences between those rendering algorithms in two areas especially: caustics and dispersion. Without going into much technical details, let's just say that Cycles is pretty bad at caustics because it's a classical path tracing renderer, so it's just a limitation of the architecture. Other algorithms like SPPM are intended for high-quality caustic work, so for example Appleseed and GeForce excel in this department. Again, there is no silver bullet, and Cycles is great in many different situations like rendering exteriors. The great caustics is just beyond its feature set for the moment. Alright, and another crucial feature of the glass shader is light dispersion or chromatic aberration. When the light ray passes through the transparent medium, it gets separated into its components: red, orange, green, and so on. Again, the vanilla path tracing algorithm is just not very good at reproducing this effect. To be able to simulate it properly, you would need a spectral rendering solution, like LuxRender for example. So these are two important features of the glass shader that we don't get in Cycles for granted. But the good news is that we can try to get around some of these limitations in Cycles, so keep watching! Let's get started by setting up Blender. If you want to get straight to the glass shader, you can skip to approximately the 8th minute mark. Okay, and another quick note that I want to mention is that your Blender interface may look a little bit different. If you want to get the exact same interface just like you see here, then follow the link in the description to download the project files. Alright, so here we have Blender 2.8 alpha version. I created a bunch of spheres, and if you enable the wireframe mode and maybe crank up the opacity of the wireframes, you will see that we have here 3 monolithic spheres. And here we have a sphere with the solidify modifier. It means it's no longer monolithic, it has walls, and these walls have some thickness. Here we have a sphere with the solidify modifier as well, but the thickness is much lower. And here we have yet another sphere with the solidify modifier. One tricky thing that in my opinion is worth mentioning is that within the central sphere we have a hemisphere. Surprise! And if we take a closer look at this hemisphere, we will notice that it has a weird kind of n-gon at the top. And this n-gon produces a weird normal shading, but I liked the way it looked, so I decided to keep it. Okay, so what's the point of having such different objects with variable thickness and stuff like that? This variable thickness will help us to preview the shader under different conditions, so it's pretty cool. Alright, I'm gonna name this material glass, or rather uber glass super advanced _01. Right off the start we have the principled BSDF shader created for us, and let's get over to the render settings, make sure that the render engine is Cycles, and underneath the viewport let's press this button. That means the Cycles viewport rendering. Also, I will come over to the viewport settings once again and disable the overlays. So here we have the principled BSDF shader, and it's very tempting to just increase the transmission all the way to 1. Basically, that means that the material will start transmitting light rays, and technically speaking, this is a glass shader already, but before doing anything else, I will select the background object and change its material. I will assign a dark gray color, reduce specularity, and hopefully that will make the glass object stand out. Then I will jump into the world settings, click on use nodes. That will create a basic environment for us, and we can see some reflections already. That's cool. What we can do now is, for example, reduce the roughness to 0, and that will mean absolutely perfect glass. Now it's a good time to tweak some render settings, because we will be using the Cycles real-time viewport for the rest of the tutorial. We want it to be fast. Let's crank up the viewport samples to 2000, and in the max bounces I will set the total number of bounces to 8, to limit the total number of bounces a little bit. Glossy to 4, transparency to 8. Transmission samples are pretty important. I will set it to 6 because we have many refractive objects. And now I will disable caustics, reflective and refractive caustics all together. That's very important because we will be simulating, or rather faking, caustics ourselves. Alright, we have the GPU compute set in the device settings, assuming that we'll be using the video card for rendering. And in the viewport settings, I will set the start pixels value to 512. Because look at this, if you leave it at 64, we'll see there's noise attack at the start of every viewport move and stuff like that. 512 helps to mitigate this issue a little bit. And in the world settings, the sampling is set to manual, max resolution to 1024, and I think that's it for the render settings. The next thing on our list before we actually move on to the shader creation is adding the HDRi environment. Let's come over to the world settings in the material tab and add the environment texture. Connect it to the color slot of the background. Now choose the HDRi texture. I will pick the Abandoned Games Room from the HDRi Heaven by Grexile. It's still one of the best resources when it comes to free HDRIs. Recommended. Okay, so I've added the mapping node as well and the texture coordinate node. Drag the generated output over there. Now we can try rotating the HDRi to find the best looking light angle. I think 260 degrees works really well because it wraps around the object in this case. And it totally makes sense from the visual standpoint because it looks good, placing the most luminant part of the HDRi slightly above the objects. Okay, in the color management settings, if we set the view transform to default and, for example, increase the strength of the environment, all the highlights will be clipped. So I will switch to filmic because it's just much better solution for working with high dynamic range data. And obviously glass is a very reflective material, so we will see the reflections of the HDRi environment, very hot highlights, very hot. Alright, I'm gonna add the RGB curves as well, because I want to increase the contrast of the environment. And I think we're good to go. Let's go back to the object mode in the material editor and make the background plate even a touch darker. I really want the glass to stand out from the background. Okay, as I've said, the principal BSDF with such settings behaves just like the usual glass shader, no difference whatsoever. But in a moment, we will try something very different. We will try reconstructing the glass shader from the individual components like refraction, then reflection on top of it, and so on. So buckle up, that will be exciting, especially if you haven't done that before. The first building block of our advanced glass shader will be refraction and dispersion. So let's drop the refraction shader into the material editor. Let's connect it to the surface output. What I will try to do in a moment is create the separate red, green and blue refraction shaders and then combine them together. That will hopefully allow us to achieve the dispersion effect. Okay, so here we have the index of refraction parameter. This parameter defines how the light is bent upon entering the refractive medium. The usual index of refraction for glass is about 1.5, and for acrylic glass is a little bit lower. For water is even lower, for air is 1. Alright, and if you try tweaking the thickness of the solidify modifier, you will see how it kind of interacts with the refraction. That's why we have objects with different thickness. Now let's add the value node and plug it into the color slot of the refraction shader. Yeah, that's value, not a color. So what are you doing, lab? Because we can do this, we can go beyond 1, beyond the white point. Alright, we can do the same with the RGB nodes, but that is a little bit more convenient for me to work this way. So I added the mix RGB node. I will switch it over to the color mode and look at this. Now we can colorize this value. What I'm going to do next is make this first component just pure red. I will set the green and blue channels to 0 and the red channel to 1, and here we go. After that I will crank up the mix factor to 1, and here we go, we have the perfect red shader. Let's add the mix shader now and copy out these nodes. You can press B to invoke the selection rectangle, then Shift D to duplicate. connect it to the second input of the mix shader. Now drag it over there, right into the surface shader output. The color of the second refraction shader will be pure green, and the mix factor between these two is 0.5. If we go all the way to 1, we will show just the green shader, all the way to 0, and the red shader will pop up, and 0.5 is just a 50-50 mix. After that, I will go Input Geometry and drop the geometry node over there. We will need the normal output. Let's hook it up to the normal input of the Refraction BSDF, that's important. And here I want to say thank you, Krista, for helping me out to understand these nodes and stuff. It was really helpful. Now place the Mix RGB node in between, select the blue color. And now it's very exciting. We can bend the normals that go into the refraction shader. We can multiply it with some microscopic value like 0.05, 0.07, something like that. And look at this. We kind of shifted or bent the refraction of the first shader, and the fringing effect showed up. I think that's wonderful. That's exactly what we need for the dispersion shader. Okay, I'm gonna add the value node to make it a little tidier, and you can press Ctrl H to minimize any node to only the active output. That's very convenient. Okay, value about 0.007, plug it into the mix factor, and the crucial thing is not to overdo this effect. I'm trying to keep it very subtle. Okay, I'm gonna copy all the normal shenanigans over there, hook it up to the normal of the Refraction BSDF, of the green shader. Now I'm gonna type something like 0.015 to make it more obvious. You can go even further if you like, but in the end it can make glass appear a little bit blurry, so I will stick to 0.015 for the moment. Press B for rectangle selection, Shift D to duplicate all these nodes. That will be the third shader, but now we need to copy the mix shader as well. Drag it over here and drag this one over there. That will be our blue component. So let's head over to the color, select pure blue, and reconnect the last mix shader to the surface output. But look at this, it seems that something went terribly wrong. The shader is way too dark and too oversaturated, I would say. The solution that I found is that we can crank up the value of the third blue shader. We can take it as high as, for example, 7. That will create an absolutely weird effect, and sometimes it seems to me that I don't know what I'm doing. But we can go over to the mix shader, to the last mix shader, and take the factor down to 0.1, something like that. But come on, now it's like crazy dark. What should we do? Don't worry just yet, we can fix it, I promise. Let's go over to the blue color and desaturate it a little bit. And don't ask me why it helps. Surprise, surprise, we have wandered into the territory of pure Blender shenanigans. At last, at last. Alright, so we can also desaturate the green color a little bit, and you can see how things are improving. Now, desaturate the red channel as well. The tricky thing here is to make sure that the color of the glass is neutral, like neutral gray. I think it already looks pretty cool, pretty neutral. And if you zoom in, you will see the wonderful fringing effect. You can go crazy with shifting the individual color channels. For example, you can take the blue, shift all the way to 0.1 and see what happens, but I would recommend to keep it subtle. And you can see that inside and outside the sphere we have the same shade of gray, and we didn't break the energy conservation law. Whoa. Let's now go to the user preferences, add-ons, search for node, Wrangler, and enable this add-on. We will need this add-on for a very cool preview functionality. You can hold Ctrl-Shift, click on the node to preview it. For example, here is our red shader. Then hold Ctrl-Shift, click on the mix shader, and yet another mix shader. You got the point. And now what we can do is, for example, create the refraction shader to compare our shader to it and to make some tweaks based on the new information. Ctrl-Shift, click on this, click on that. See the wonderful chromatic aberration effect? Whoa, I would like to tweak the tone of the glass a little bit. Yeah, I think now it's really neutral. and especially in the higher contrast areas, the effect of separating different wavelengths of light ray really shows up. The fake effect, I should have said, but who cares, as long as it looks believable. It's the never-ending debate of physically correct versus physically plausible. Right, what I'm gonna do now is select all these nodes, press Shift-P to automatically draw a frame around them. That works only if you have the node wrangler enabled once again. And now I'm gonna make the label a little bit larger, so we will be able to see it clearly. Because, you know, 10 minutes later, our advanced glass shader will look like absolutely horrifying spaghetti monster. We will need some clarity. Okay, cool. The second component of our shader is reflection, so let's add the mix shader, drop it over there, then press Shift-A, shader, glossy BSDF, and drag it over there. So now we have two main components, refraction and reflection, in place. We just have to mix them in some particular way, because right now refraction is kind of overpowered by the reflection, and a glass should behave obviously like dielectric, not like metal. So let's add the Fresnel node and plug it into the mix factor. This node maps the geometry of the object to the black and white gradient based on the angle from the camera to the surface point. So basically all glancing angles will be white. And we can also plug the color ramp node afterwards if you really want to play with the angle and fine-tune the Fresnel effect. See, now the reflection only appears on the glancing angles, which is pretty cool, but you know what, I will delete the color ramp. Shift-P to create a frame around these nodes, and to open the right tool shelf, let's call it reflection. And you know what, I have a feeling, but first let's compare it with the glass shader, with the regular glass. Yeah, I have a feeling that I made a mistake, and I will try to explain it in a moment. Basically, while the bare Fresnel looks pretty nice, with the help of the color ramp we would be able to fine-tune it more carefully. So this is a usual glass shader, pay attention to the edges. And this is our shader with the combined refraction and reflection, and some dispersion. Dispersion works great, here we have no such effect, but on the other hand, take a look at this dark outline going around the sphere. When you try to mix the reflection in by using the Fresnel node without any adjustments, you will inevitably get such outline. What we can do to mask it is, well, use color ramp node to tweak the mix factor between reflection and refraction a little bit. See how the white flag, the highlights, has been moved to the left, and the additional stop, the gray flag, has been added in between. And while we have the same Fresnel effect with the same index of refraction in place, by adjusting its contrast we remove this gradient. Yeah, that's definitely something worth noting. Now let's get back to our material nodes and see what we have. So, two blocks. First one being refraction plus dispersion, and the second one reflection. Now it's time for yet another component, which is subsurface scattering and a touch of translucency. But first let's talk about muting nodes. You can mute nodes like this, and unmute them like this. Or you can hit M to mute, M to unmute. The simple tools like this go a long way, especially when you have to deal with spaghetti monsters of any kind. Okay, let's add the Add shader, and then the subsurface scattering shader. With this shader we will simulate the effect of the light trapped and scattered inside the medium because of some micro bubbles and stuff like that. But first I will add the geometry node and also the normal node. And I will hook the normal output over there and connect the dot output to the color input of the subsurface scattering. Basically, I want to control where the SSS effect appears on the mesh. For example, I want to make sure that only the top or bottom portion of the mesh gets the additional scattering effect going on. That's why we added the normal node, and the color ramp is just the contrast. And to make the effect slightly less in your face, I will reduce the brightness of the right flag. Actually, it will be a very, very subtle effect, just a little bit of diffusion going on. Like a barely visible mist, you know, inside the glass. You can even add some tint to it, as if there are some irregularities within the volumetric glass texture that bend the light spectrum a bit. And to make it even more complex and obscure, I will go ahead and add yet another mix shader. Then Shift A, Translucent BSDF. The Translucent BSDF within Blender works in a very similar fashion to Subsurface scattering. It permits light to pass through, but diffuses it, just like frosted glass, for example. Right now the translucency really overwhelms everything else, so I will set the color to dark gray and will reduce the mix factor to some 0.1 number. Let's now zoom in to see it more clearly. Look at the edge of the sphere. Translucency adds this milky effect to the material of the sphere. So here we go. That was our SSS plus translucency block. For the time being though, I will just mute the add shader to reduce the strain on the computer, because this is a quite demanding shader. But you know, we will enable it just before hitting the final render. Okay, awesome. Now it's time for implementing the absorption component. Let's start off with pressing Shift A, go shader, mix shader as usual. See, we're back on track. We no longer use the add shader because the add shader is really not physically correct at all. Alright, so what I did here is added the standard glass shader, and let's give it a heavy tint. For example, let's make it a bluish color, or no, let's make it look like a cognac because it's much more fun. The point is to make it look like some big portion of the spectrum is absorbed and only the red part of the spectrum comes through. And to make it happen, we need to use some math. At first I saw this technique, I think it was the article by Gottfried Hoffman. It was wonderful. So we need the back-facing attribute from the geometry node multiplied with the Raylength attribute from the light path node. Gottfried recreated some real absorption formula. We will stick to just fake solution that works just as well, I claim. Well, maybe slightly worse. And by the way, I replaced mix RGB with math node just for the sake of clarity. So let's multiply back-facing with the Raylength, clump the results, add the color ramp node. And on second thought, clumping the multiply node isn't really required because color ramp will output the values between 0 and 1 anyway. But right, it doesn't really matter. Here the color ramp will serve as a way to control the effect in terms of simple visual manipulation with flags. So we hooked it up to the mix factor, and that made the thick areas reveal the second shader, the cognac shader. And by the way, just a friendly reminder, inside the central sphere we have a hemisphere occupying the lower portion of the mesh. That's why we see lots of absorption here. Alright, I pressed Ctrl H to collapse this node to show only the active output, and here I will plug in the hue saturation value node and increase the value. That is another purely perceptual tweak, not physically correct at all. But anyway, we achieved a little bit of absorption based on the length of the ray traced by cycles, the ray that penetrates the geometry and reveals the second shader. Works pretty darn well. And for the color of the tinted glass, we can use the same trick that we used before. We can have a value that is greater than 1, then use the mix RGB node, switched into the color mode to colorize this value. Maybe at some point we would like to make it look like a dragon blood, so glowing. Actually, how does the dragon blood look? Does it shimmer in the dark? Does it have a golden tint? Maybe does it break the energy conservation law? I think it would be a shame if it's physically correct. Like, it shouldn't be. Anyway, what I really love about the absorption effect is that it's dynamic. If you try scaling up or down the object, you will see what I mean. By scaling up and down the sphere, you will change the thickness of the glass, and thus you will change the ratio between these two shaders. That's very intriguing. Like, you get a color variety for free if you have many different types of objects. Right, next we will tackle fake caustics. Caustics is a huge pain in unidirectional path tracing engines like Cycles, just due to the architecture of the algorithm. Especially the refractive caustics, of course. If you turn it on in Cycles, you will either have to wait for a long time for caustics to converge, or you will have to use denoising. That actually has an enormous potential, I think, but still, sometimes it's just better to take control over the situation and fake caustics altogether. That's exactly what I'm gonna do now, so let's go ahead and add the mix shader. Then add the transparent shader. We will use it for shadows only. Yeah, we will require yet another light path node. We have already used it for the absorption, but this time we will use yet another output of this wonderful node, namely the HDRi output. We will plug it straight into the mix factor. Let me unpack it really quickly. HDRi means that for all the shadow rays, we will switch to the second material, which will be the transparent BSDF with some twist. What was that? God damn it. To put it bluntly, we will boost the luminosity value of the shadows beyond the physically correct value to make the shadows appear brighter than the light actually hitting the object, which is obviously insane. But that is a shortcut to the fake caustics. So let's go ahead and add the geometry node, then throw in the vector math node. We will need yet another geometry node. What I will do next is connect the normals over there and the incoming output over there. What we would need is the dot product. I have no idea what I'm doing. It's like magic that blooms only in rare souls. We also need the color ramp, and we have to invert the colors like that, compress the range like that, drag everything into the transparent BSDF node, and to reveal the effect finally we will need to multiply it by 2 or something like that. I guess it depends on the scene, but 1.7 seems to be working pretty well. Notice the beautiful, absolutely fake caustics, but you know what, we need a few more flags in between to add some more definition, to add some details into the caustics texture. Again, it all boils down to some imaginary irregularities within the glass. That's a good reason to use the tricks like that. Let's add the area light just for the debug purposes. Alright, so now the shape of the shadow is pretty evident. Umbra, penumbra, all that stuff. Hopefully that will make it easier to tweak the color ramp to change the shape of caustics. So let's go back to the node editor by simply selecting the glass object. I think it looks pretty cool, but I don't really like the overall opacity of the shadow. I want to make it a little bit more transparent, so I will go ahead and tweak the right flag to the point of neutral gray color, as if the glass material simply permits most of the light to pass through without standing in the way. Yeah, something like this. Yeah, that looks good to me. Now we can delete the light source, the debug light source by pressing X. Gone. And what is wonderful about this technique is that the shape of caustics kind of interacts with the environment, because as we remember, under the hood is just a shadow. So look at this. This illusion can trick the untrained eye, I think. Definitely, yeah. So what can we do to make it a little bit more interesting and believable? Let's go to the object mode of the material editor. What I'm going to do next is spice it up with some procedural noise as a sort of colorization mechanism, because right now the caustics is uniform despite the fact that the glass is multicolored. That doesn't make sense. So let's throw in the mix RGB node, switch it to the orange color, set the mode to color, and the noise shader will be plugged into the mix factor. Hopefully that will allow us to break up the uniform look. Let's select the noise texture, press Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping node. Again, you need the node Wrangler done to be able to use this hotkey. Let's also include the color ramp node in between the noise texture and the mix RGB. Now we can play with the contrast and maybe shift the coordinates in the mapping node. You can press Ctrl Shift and click on the node to preview it. What I'm trying to do here is make some areas of the mesh give the orange tint to the shadow rays passing through, based of course on the noise texture as a mix factor. I think this cognac shadow already looks pretty darn convincing. I love it, but let's take it a step further. Let's press Shift D to duplicate all these noise nodes. Let's also grab the mix node, Shift D to duplicate, drop it over there, switch it into the mix mode. The idea behind these shenanigans is mix everything with black by using the noise texture as a control texture to be able to influence the overall pattern of caustics in the scene, if that makes sense. I hope it does make sense. Alright, so to sum it up, we have two noise textures on top of our initial fake caustics effect. The first one for colorization and the second one for controlling the overall density, or rather strength, of the caustics. Probably we could have gotten away with just using the initial setup for caustics without any noise shenanigans. But on the other hand, now we have the ultimate control over the process, so that was worth it. In the end, we have to do it only once, and now you can copy-paste this setup across the different shaders and even across the different scenes. Your mind must be blown. Give yourself a second. 2, 1. Stay a while and listen. Gotcha. Alright, so we have already simulated the volumeric absorption, but we also have the real physically correct volume, and the volume bounces are set to 0. That's alright, because the bounces beyond 0 can be really noisy. Okay, so let's add the volume scatter and the volume absorption shaders. We need to combine these shaders together with the help of the add shader. Of course, we can reduce the number of steps and just use the new principled volume shader added to Blender 2.8 Alpha. Maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I still prefer volume scatter and volume absorption combo. You can already see that we added some smoky look to our shader, and usually the density parameters of these two shaders are interconnected, so we can just plug one value into two density inputs to control them simultaneously, like this. So we created a globe with Silent Hill inside, apparently. And we can do the same trick with the RGB node. We can use it to drive the colors, like this, but actually what I want to do is disconnect all of this and control the colors separately, so the bluish tint for the scatter effect and the orangish tint for the absorption. Say, let's keep pushing it into the amber direction, into the cognac direction. If we bring up the density of the absorption, the glass material will become more and more opaque. That may or may not be what you want. So I will stick to some modest value like 1, and I'm gonna tweak the scatter density as well. Let's say 0.7 works pretty well, I think. Adds just a little bit of fog. And before proceeding, I would like to warn you, because the volume shaders take a long time to render. Sometimes it's wise to just disable it altogether and enable just before the final render. Okay, what's next? Next is roughness, because it seems to me that we nailed down all the major components of the advanced glass shader, like absorption, fake caustics, reflection, subsurface scattering, refraction and dispersion. Yeah, now we need to figure out the right way of setting up the roughness texture. First, I will add the image texture and then press Ctrl T to auto-generate the mapping node and the texture coordinate node with the help of the node Wrangler add-on. I will use the generated coordinates instead of the UV coordinates. Now I'm gonna hit open, navigate to my folder with one texture, which is this hexagon texture that I downloaded from Pixabay. I will click on the flat and select box instead as a projection mode. That will just project this texture from all directions, and to eliminate the seam, I will bring up the blend parameter. And finally, I will add our beloved color ramp node. We're gonna be dealing with the roughness texture, right? So black will mean 0 roughness, and white will mean the roughness of 1. Now we need to preview the final shader somehow, so let's navigate to the right end of this node spaghetti and get back over there. Let's connect it to the roughness input, but everything is so painfully slow, and that's because we haven't disabled the volume shader, and it slows everything down. Okay, so we disconnected it, and now it's a lot better. At least we can connect the texture and the shader, and that's something. So what we will do next is hold Shift and drag across this line to create this reroute point. That will hopefully help us to organize this whole thing in a visually clear way, because now we need to find all nodes with the roughness inputs, and we need to connect this reroute point to these inputs. So here we have the glass shader, and on the left we have the reflection shader and 3 refraction shaders, red, green and blue. So I'm creating a bunch of different reroute points all across the board. I'm going all in with the reroute points. I'm building this architecture to make it visually readable, because otherwise it will be a total mess. And when we are done with this basic setup, we can actually proceed with tweaking the roughness texture. The color ramp here is like the end point of our tweak chain. And this is precisely where you define what type of glass is your glass. Is it an acrylic glass? Is it a frosted glass? Maybe it's an ice. What? Anyway, this is a crucial parameter of our advanced glass shader. We do it last, but it's not the least important. Okay, what I will do next is Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V to copy-paste this set of nodes that we used for the roughness texture. And let's use it as the displacement texture, or rather the bump texture. Look at this. Oh, god damn it. What a mess. Actually, it's interesting. I find it very appealing, but that's not what I was aiming for. Let's turn the displacement method to bump only. Who set it to displacement? Let's now jump back into the cycles viewport rendering mode, and it looks awesome. But here is a trick. What we see in the viewport is oftentimes misguiding a little bit. Just trust me, it's easy to overdo the bump map. Let's tone it down right away. First, I will reduce the contrast of the color ramp, and as the second measure, I will go Shift-A, Converter, Math. Click here, select Multiply. So what I will do is multiply it by 0.1, so effectively I will divide it by 10, and that will reduce the intensity of the bump tenfold. Or even, let's take it further down, maybe 0.01. On render it will still have a very pronounced effect, especially combined with the roughness map. So yeah, let's keep it at 0.01. Right, awesome. We have all the major boxes ticked. Now we can try implementing a speed up hack. We don't really have to do it, but in some cases it may come in handy. So let's take a look at how it can be done. First, we have to introduce yet another mix shader, and we will be mixing it with the transparent shader. And we will be using the light path node once again. I saw this trick in the gemstone tutorial by Anthony Pylon. So it goes like this. Let's add the light path node, converter math node. Now we need to compare two types of rays, the shadow ray and the reflection ray. Set the mathematical operation to maximum. Basically, it will output whichever value is bigger. And then we will need yet another math node and drag this output over here. But this time we will compare it with the ray depth. Essentially, the idea is to switch over to the transparent shader for the reflection bounces that are greater than a certain value. So we need to introduce yet another math node. The operation should be set to greater than. And now we just need to provide some value. And the value node may come in handy in this case. So drop it over there. This will be our number of bounces. And we will tell Blender if the ray depth, the number of bounces are greater than 4, then switch over to the transparent shader. Well, something along these lines, because I cannot fully wrap my head around this concept. But anyway, it works. For example, we can set it to 2, and that will mean that for every reflection ray after the second bounce, we will switch over to the transparent shader. That definitely helps to reduce the amount of fireflies, the overall levels of noise, but obviously it messes the shader. It's no longer the physically plausible glass shader. It's something like the transparent shader with a bit of reflectivity. But if you are in a really tight situation, you can try implementing this hack. But for now, I will mute the mix shader, so I will disable this speed up. Anyway, I think our advanced glass shader is pretty optimized on its own. We kind of faked everything already. Next, before we hit the render button, it's time for some final tweaks. So let's take a look at what we have done. Here is our final shader. Looks spectacular. We started off by simulating dispersion, by combining 3 different refraction shaders, red, green and blue. Then we layered some reflection on top of it. It's just a usual glossy shader. After that, we added some translucency and subsurface scattering effects. It is disabled at the moment. And also we added the absorption based on the Raylength. After that, we plugged in the fake Caustics effect based on the transparent shader and is shadow ray node as a mix factor. Implemented a neat speed up hack that we ended up not using. Spiced it up with the bump map and the roughness map, and also the volumeric shader, volume scatter and volume absorption that went straight into the volume input of the material. Now let's go through all the nodes once again and enable all bells and whistles before hitting the render button. Okay, so the speed up, no thanks. What we have here is Caustics, let's enable it, let's unmute the node. Okay, what about the render settings? I don't see any reason for the glossy bounces to go beyond 2 or maybe 3. The transparency bounces should stay high, and what about the transmission bounces? It's a little bit tricky because if we over-optimize it, we will lose the essential qualities of glass. Like the light rays will no longer be able to pass through the light, and that is ridiculous. But maybe you're aiming for this effect, so go ahead in this case, I guess. Alright, cool. Before actually rendering the image, I will enable burn into image in the metadata tab. That'll bake the render time and other statistics into the image. Okay, the resolution is set to 1080p, and now it's time for render. Hooray! It can take a considerable amount of time, but the test renders obviously are not that bad. 3.5 minutes. It looks remarkable, but we still see lots of noise. That is a normal thing. It's totally expected, and we can try to balance it to some extent by using denoising. So go ahead and enable denoising, and I'm gonna set the radius to 5 and both strength and feature strength to 0.25. That'll make it a little bit less smooth and less destructive in my opinion. And now let's switch to the render slot number 3, hit the magical F12 button. Now we will see 2 types of render buckets clearing the screen for us. The first one is just the path tracing bucket, and the second one is the denoising bucket. Now the render time will be a little bit higher, 338 versus 327, but considering that the image now looks way more smooth, I think it's totally worth it. It's especially cool that the denoising algorithm killed the multicolored hot pixels, so-called fireflies, that otherwise would be so hellishly hard to deal with. And now, after we are done with rendering this stuff, we deserved a little bit of compositing. It's just a way of relaxing after the work done and getting some gratification back. For example, let's add some glare, that's a no-brainer. It just works so well with the reflective and refractive materials. The glare helps to reveal and emphasize, I would say, the areas with the high luminosity values. It works so well with the glass material. And we can add the lens distortion on top of it and increase the dispersion value, and it's pretty ironic. We spent like half an hour building this shader and we can just use this node in the compositor and bam! But no, our lens distortion is much better, much more sophisticated. Keep telling it to yourself. But maybe we can add just a little touch of the lens distortion in the compositing as well. I would say if we enable the projector mode and not overdo the dispersion, like if we set it to 0.8, it will turn into a mess, so let's keep it lower. Yeah, I think it looks alright. It even helps to smear the noise furthermore, so it makes a nice combo with denoiser. It's like an additional denoising pass. It looks great. Alright folks, I think that's it. The last thing that I will do is set the render samples to 1024. If I had to do the super final, high resolution final render 01, I would have set it to even higher value. It all depends on how far you want to stretch it, and yet another possibility of reducing the render time is to use the branched path tracing algorithm. Branched means that we can treat the different types of light rays separately. For example, we can crank up the number of transmission samples, and that totally makes sense in this situation because probably the 90% of the noise comes from the transmission rays. But I don't want to go in this direction, so I will switch back to the classical path tracing. Alright, and that concludes our Uber Glass shader tutorial for Blender. I really love the final result. I think it looks awesome. Here you can see some additional test renders that I made using this shader. And if you want to play with this shader, feel free to download it. I included the link in the description below the video. Just follow the link to download the files and have fun. Thanks for watching. That's it, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. That was Gleb Alexandrov for CreativeShrimp.com. To learn more, I would recommend you to check out real spectral rendering engines like Appleseed or LuxRender. It has a plugin for Blender, so feel free to check it out. And also there is a wonderful thread on Blender Artist about integrating some kind of spectral rendering solution right into cycles. It's a very clever hack and it's very promising. Drink more coffee and we'll change the world of computer graphics. And now I should have shown you some amazing animation, so I will orchestrate it for you in real time using PureRef magical tool. Yeah, that's it.